Now that I've completed the setup, I'll be writing the VEX that will be the logic for the HeightField color layer digital asset. So to begin with, I'm just going to add in, let's just set these to some very obvious colors. So I'm going to set the first base layer to red, I'm going to set the second one to green, and then finally the third one to blue. And I'm also going to check enable on each one of these layers. So that's just got some kind of basic information in there so I can start building my logic, and we can be sure that when we see some color appear in the viewport, we know it's working. So the first thing I'm going to type here is vector color to create a vector variable called color equals v at cd, end with a semicolon. So in this particular instance, I've not actually got any information stored yet on this color variable, but if I did, I'll be getting any existing information that's stored on our color layer that we created and storing it on a vector variable called color. Because when I created these three layers, I called them cd.r with this .r, it has created these as a vector, 3 channels of a vector. So that means I can call these using v at cd. So the next thing I'm going to do is create our for loop. So I'm going to type for, open brackets, and write out our first statement, which is going to be int I equals 1, and then end that with a semicolon. So we're creating a variable called I, which is an integer, and storing that with on that a value of 1. And now we're going to write out our second statement. And if you remember, this second statement defines whether or not this loop should be run. And so if this statement is true, the loop will run. And for this particular statement, I'm going to type I is less than or equals to, and what I want this to test is whether or not I is less than or equal to our number of layers. So I want to reference this particular parameter, and this particular parameter is called layers. So I'm going to type in here chi, because this channel is an integer, this is a whole number, and open brackets, add a quotation mark, and then type in the name of this parameter, which if I hover over, we can see is called layers. So type layers, close quotation mark, close bracket, and end with a semicolon. And then, as I did previously in the other examples, the third statement is going to be I plus plus to increment the value of I, and then close bracket to close out these 3 statements. And hit return, add a curly bracket, and then hit return a couple more times and add the close curly bracket. So this is our for loop. It's now written out. And what do I want to do? Well, I want to loop through each one of these parameters and get the information from the parameter. So I want to, on the first loop, get whether or not this particular parameter is enabled, what layer have we specified, and also the color. And that will be done on the first loop. We'll then loop through again, get the information on the second parameter, loop through, and get the information on the third parameter. So the first thing I'm going to do is get the number of the layer that we're on and store that in a string variable. So I'm going to type string layer number is equal to I, end with a semicolon. And if I click in my viewport, we get an error. A middle mouse click, we can see invalid assignment from integer to string. So I here is an integer, whereas the variable I'm creating here is a string. And so I can't pass an integer to a string variable. So what I need to do is convert this integer to a string. I'm going to do that using a function. And that function is called itoa. And then open brackets. And that gives information about this function. And we can see it says converts an integer to a string, which is exactly what I need. So let's place that I within this function, and now we don't get an error. So I has been converted to a string and stored on this variable called layer number. And the first thing I want to do is then retrieve the whether or not this parameter is enabled or disabled. So I'm going to create an integer variable. So type int, and this is going to be called layer enable. And as I did here with chi layers, I can retrieve or reference a parameter by typing equals chi, because this is an integer. If it's disabled, it returns a value of 0. If it's enabled, it returns a value of 1. So chi for integer, and then I'm going to open brackets and then single quotation mark layer enable underscore. So this parameter is called layer enable underscore, and then I want to append to the end of this a value of 1, or the number of the layer, which I've stored on this string variable. So I can join these together by closing that quotation mark and typing plus layer number, close quotation mark, end semicolon. And we haven't got any errors, so we know this logic is working. So now that we have this layer enable installed on a variable, we can write an if statement to say whether or not we want to do anything with this information. Because if it's disabled, we're saying, nope, don't worry about this particular parameter, move on to the next one. So let's type an if statement that says, if layer enable is equal to 1, then continue and run this logic. If it's not, don't do anything, move on to the next loop. So in here, I'm going to type a string variable called layer name. And just as we did here with this enable parameter, I'm going to type in here chs for string, and I want to return the layer name, which if I hover over is called layer name underscore 1. So let's add a single quotation mark, type layer name underscore, close quotation mark, plus layer number. So again, on the first loop, it will return the name in this particular parameter. On the second loop, this name, and so on. Let's do the same again, but get the color information that's in the color parameter by typing vector layer color is equal to chv, as it is because that parameter is a vector, and type layer color underscore, close quotation mark, plus layer number, close brackets, end it with a semicolon. So now we're at a point where we have all of the information from our interface stored in variables, whether or not the layer is enabled, its name, and its color. The next thing we want to get is, if I just add a HeightField visualize, and hit no change, custom tinting, and I'm going to type in here, for example, lowlands. So what we want to do is use this mask to blend between two different colors. The color that's already on our landscape and the color that we're specifying in our parameter. So I want to retrieve this mask so I can then use it to blend between two different colors. So on our HeightField Wrangle, after this vector variable, I want to create a float variable called layer mask is equal to, and I'm going to use a function called volume sample to sample the volume and return that mask. And the mask that I want to return is whichever layer is specified in our layer name parameter. If I type the function and then open the first bracket, we can see what information this particular function needs. First of all, it needs the geometry that we want to sample. the name of the volume we want to sample, so the name of the layer, and then a position. So I can type 0, which references the first input of our HeightField Wrangle, and the layer that I want to sample I have stored on this string variable. So I can copy that and paste that in here. And then finally a position, and I can type @p, close bracket, end semicolon. So now all left to do is use a function to blend between the color that's already on the landscape and the color that's specified in our parameter. And I could do that using another function. So I'm going to type color, and that's going to return the vector variable that we created right at the start, and say this is equal to, and then I'm going to type lerp, open brackets, and so this interpolates between two different values, and those values are going to be color, so the color that's already on our landscape, and the color that's specified in our parameter, which I've stored on this layer color variable. And the value that I want to use to lerp between these two colors is our layer mask. Close that bracket, end with a semicolon, and the final thing that we need to do is now pass this color variable back to our color attribute. So right at the end here, I'm going to type v@cd is equal to color, and then with any luck, add a semicolon, and we should see some color in our viewport. And there we go. Let's just make this a bit smaller and give us some more room. So there we go. Now we have some color in our viewport based on the colors we specified in our parameters. I can enable or disable the layers, and I can continue to add additional layers. So in the next video, I'm going to be wrapping up these nodes into a digital asset to create a more kind of artist-friendly user experience.